What Hitler said when D-Day succeeded and 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. June 6th, 1944, 5:47 a.m. Outside, the world is changing. 700 miles to the west, across occupied France, the largest amphibious invasion in human history is unfolding. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men. The fate of Europe, hanging in the balance. But inside this room, in the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, there is only silence, and a man sleeping so deeply that the end of his empire cannot wake him. Colonel General Alfred Jodl stands in the hallway, hand raised to knock, then lowering it again. He's been standing here for 3 minutes. Behind him, 2 junior officers wait, faces pale, reports clutched in trembling hands. Through the heavy oak door, nothing, no movement, no sound, just the steady, oblivious breathing of a dictator who has taken enough barbiturates to sleep through the apocalypse. Jodl knows the rules. Everyone at the Berghof knows the rules. Hitler retired at 3 a.m. after watching films and eating cake with his inner circle, his usual routine. He took his sleeping medication, a cocktail prescribed by Dr. Theodore Morel that includes barbital, a powerful sedative that renders him almost comatose until late morning. He gave strict orders. No one disturbs him before 10 a.m. Not for anything. The penalties for disobedience are severe and unpredictable. Officers have been sent to the Eastern Front for smaller infractions. Some have simply disappeared into the night. Their fates never officially explained. Jodl has witnessed Hitler's rages, the screaming, the spittle, the furniture thrown, the accusations of betrayal and cowardice. But this is different. This isn't a supply problem or a minor tactical setback. This is the invasion, the one they've been preparing for, arguing about, planning against for months. And it started 4 hours ago. Jodl knocks, softly at first. Nothing. He knocks harder. Still nothing. The sleeping pills have done their work too well. Inside that room, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the German Armed Forces, Führer of the Third Reich, the man whose decisions will determine whether Germany can repel this invasion, is unconscious, not strategizing, not issuing orders, not rallying his forces. Unconscious, while his armies in France desperately radio for reinforcements, for permission to move reserve units, for authorization to commit the panzer divisions that sit idle just miles from the invasion beaches. Jodl pounds on the door now, abandoning protocol. Mein Führer. Urgent news from France. A curse from inside. Movement. The door opens. Hitler stands there in his nightshirt. Hair uncombed. Face puffy and gray. At 54, he looks a decade older. In this moment, skin sallow. Eyes struggling to focus. Hands trembling slightly from the pharmacological cocktail still in his system. This is not the commanding figure from propaganda newsreels. This is a man dragged from chemical unconsciousness, irritated and disoriented. This had better be important, Jodl. Mein Führer. The invasion has begun. Normandy. Paratroopers landed at 1 a.m. Naval bombardment started at dawn. Multiple beach landings are underway. American, British, Canadian forces. Thousands of ships. Hitler stares at him. 3 seconds. 4, 5. Not processing. Not reacting. Just staring. Then something shifts in his expression. His eyes sharpen. His mouth curves into something that isn't quite a smile but suggests satisfaction. So, they've finally done it. They've shown their hand. This is the moment that will define everything that follows. Not alarm. Not urgency. Satisfaction. As if the Allies have made a mistake by invading at all. Hitler turns back into the room, leaving the door open. Jodl follows, dread building in his chest. Because he recognizes that expression. He's seen it before. In strategy meetings when Hitler announces that he's seen through some supposed Allied deception, that he understands their real plan, while his generals are fooled by surface appearances. It's the expression of a man who believes he's the smartest person in the room. And right now, That belief is about to cost Germany the war. Hitler walks to the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the peaceful Bavarian mountains. Normandy, he says. Not Pas de Calais. Interesting. Jodl waits. He's learned over years of serving Hitler that interrupting during these thinking moments is dangerous. Outside, birds sing in the alpine morning. Somewhere below, a dog barks. The war, the actual war, with men dying on beaches 700 miles away, feels impossibly distant. It's a feint, Hitler says finally. Obviously. His voice carries absolute certainty. They want us to commit our reserves to Normandy. Then they'll launch the real invasion at Calais. That's where it makes sense strategically. Shortest crossing, closest to Germany. Eisenhower thinks he's being clever. Jodl has the latest reports in his hand. He's read them multiple times while standing outside that door. 5 separate landing beaches. Airborne divisions dropped behind German lines to secure bridges and crossroads. Thousands of ships, the reports say. The horizon is black with them. Naval gunfire, systematically destroying German coastal fortifications. This doesn't match a feint. This matches exactly what Allied planners would do if Normandy was their main effort. But Jodl has also learned that contradicting Hitler's strategic assessments is a career-ending move at best. At worst, it's a life-ending move. Mein Führer. The scale of the operation. I'm aware of the scale, Jodl. Hitler's voice sharpens. I'm also aware of British deception capabilities. Remember Operation Mincemeat? The corps with false invasion plans that fooled the Italians? The dummy tanks before El Alamein? They're masters of deception. We will not be fooled. He's already made up his mind. Not based on the evidence in those reports. Based on what he believes the evidence should show. Get me the latest intelligence. Everything. And get me Keitel. We need to assess this properly before committing anything. That word, committing. Jodl feels something cold settle in his stomach. Because the Panzer divisions, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend near Lisieux, the Panzerlehr Division near Le Mans are already in position to strike. Both units are within hours of the Normandy beaches. Both are ready to move. Both are waiting for authorization that only Hitler can give. And Hitler, now fully dressed in his uniform, is smiling. Actually smiling. This could be perfect, Jodl. If they've committed everything to Normandy, we can destroy them there. Drive them back into the sea. Show the world that Fortress Europe cannot be breached. The strategic logic is impeccable. The strategic logic is also completely, catastrophically wrong. But Adolf Hitler has built his entire worldview on the conviction that his strategic instincts are superior to conventional military thinking. France, 1,940. His generals said the invasion plan through the Ardennes was too risky. He insisted. France fell in 6 weeks. Soviet Union, 1,941. Everyone advised against invading. He insisted. His armies reached the outskirts of Moscow. His track record of defying military orthodoxy and winning has convinced him that his intuition is infallible, that when his instincts contradict evidence, it's the evidence that's wrong. And so, as the sun rises higher over the Bavarian Alps, as Allied troops pour onto Normandy beaches in numbers that dwarf any previous amphibious assault, as German commanders in France desperately request permission to move their panzer reserves, Adolf Hitler orders breakfast and begins his morning routine, convinced he's seeing through Allied deception, convinced he's being strategically brilliant, convinced that patience now will allow him to spring the perfect trap later. The man who refused to wake is now awake, but he might as well still be sleeping, because the decisions he's about to make, or rather, the decisions he's about to refuse to make, will ensure that by the time he accepts reality, it will be far too late to matter. 10:30 a.m., June 6th, 1944. The Berghof's Situation Room. Large map tables covered with military charts. Telephone lines connecting to headquarters across occupied Europe. Staff officers moving with controlled urgency, updating position markers, taking reports. Hitler enters, freshly shaved, uniform immaculate. The trembling from the sleeping pills has subsided. He looks to the officers assembled, like the Führer they know from newsreels, commanding, focused, in control. But Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, standing at the main map table, sees something else in Hitler's eyes, a glitter of absolute certainty. And Keitel, who has served as chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces since 1938, has learned that Hitler's certainty is often inversely proportional to reality. The more convinced Hitler becomes of something, the less likely it is to be true. Keitel presents the latest intelligence. 5 landing zones now confirmed. Utah and Omaha beaches on the Cotentin Peninsula and near Bayou American forces. Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches British and Canadian forces. Airborne divisions American 82nd and 101st, British 6th, have secured key terrain behind the beaches. Naval gunfire is devastating German positions. Coastal batteries that survived the bombing are being methodically destroyed by battleships and cruisers, firing from ranges the shore guns cannot match. How many ships? The report from Admiral Theodor Kranke, Naval Group Command West, is almost apologetic in its imprecision. Impossible to count accurately, Mein Führer. The horizon is obscured by vessels. Estimates range from 800 to over 4,000. Hitler nods, as if this confirms something. And aircraft? Allied air superiority is absolute. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights are being shot down before they can complete assessments. Fighter-bomber attacks on German positions are continuous. How many troops ashore? By 10 a.m., estimates suggest 50,000. The number is climbing rapidly. Hitler studies the map for a long moment. His finger traces the coastline from Calais down to Normandy. The shortest distance from England to France, Pas de Calais, barely 20 miles across the Dover Strait. Normandy, over 100 miles. Look at the geography, he says. His voice carries the patience of a teacher explaining something obvious to slow students. Calais is the logical landing point. Shortest crossing, best ports, direct route to the Ruhr industrial region. He taps the map at Normandy. This is 200 miles from London, 300 miles from the Ruhr. The ports here, Cherbourg, Le Havre, are either too small or too heavily fortified. From a purely strategic standpoint, Normandy makes no sense as a main invasion point. The logic is perfect. The logic is also completely disconnected from what's actually happening. But around the table, no one contradicts him, because in Hitler's headquarters, contradiction is dangerous. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Commander-in-Chief West, tries a different approach. Mein Führer, even if this is a diversion, the scale requires response. Field Marshal von Rundstedt requests authorization to move. No. Hitler's voice cuts like a blade. Not yet, but Mein Führer. I said, not yet, General. The room goes quiet. Hitler begins to pace, hands behind his back, the posture he adopts when explaining his strategic vision. Think like Eisenhower. Think like the British. They know we expect Calais. They know Rommel has fortified those beaches. So, what do? They launch a major operation at Normandy, big enough to look real, big enough to draw our attention. Then, when we've committed our reserves, when we've moved our panzers away from Calais, that's when the real invasion comes. He stops pacing, turns to face his officers. It's exactly what I would do in their position. Create overwhelming force at the diversion point. Make it impossible to ignore. Force the enemy to react. Then strike where they've weakened themselves. The analysis is brilliant. The analysis is also describing an operation that isn't happening. But Hitler has convinced himself. And when Hitler convinces himself of something, evidence becomes irrelevant. The telephone rings. Keitel answers, listens, his face carefully neutral. Mein Führer. Field Marshal von Rundstedt again. He reports that the 21st Panzer Division has attempted a counterattack toward the beaches. They were stopped by British anti-tank positions and naval gunfire. The division commander reports heavy losses and requests Let me guess. Reinforcements. Authorization to commit the reserve panzers. Yes, Mein Führer. Denied. But, Mein Führer, every hour we delay, the British and Americans commit more to Normandy. Every hour we delay, they move forces away from Calais. We are not going to be rushed into a mistake by an enemy feint, no matter how elaborate. Von Rundstedt, 700 miles away at his headquarters outside Paris, receives this response and says nothing for 10 full seconds. Then, to his chief of staff, he's going to let them consolidate the beachhead. He's going to give them exactly what they need. Back at the Berghof, Hitler is explaining his strategy to staff officers who dare not disagree. Patience. That's what wins wars. The Allies expect us to panic. They expect us to rush our reserves toward Normandy in disarray. Instead, we'll wait. We'll assess. We'll respond intelligently when their real plan reveals itself. By noon, the numbers from Normandy are undeniable, even to the most optimistic German intelligence officers. Over 100,000 Allied troops ashore. The beachhead is expanding. German units are being pushed back or overrun. Requests for reinforcements are pouring in from every sector, and Hitler's response is the same. Wait. Contain them. Do not commit the reserves. Jodl tries one more time. Mein Führer, with respect. If this is the main invasion, it's not. But if it is, it's not. Jodl. Hitler's patience is fraying now. Use your head. Look at the strategic situation. Britain and America have been planning this invasion for 2 years. Do you really think they'd choose a landing site that makes no strategic sense? That they'd commit their entire invasion force to a location that's further from their bases, further from Germany, with worse port facilities? The rhetorical questions hang in the air. And Jodl has no answer. Because Hitler isn't asking questions. He's explaining why everyone else is wrong and he's right. This is what military psychologist Dave Grossman would later identify as cognitive commitment. The psychological phenomenon where individuals become so invested in a particular interpretation of events that contradictory evidence is reinterpreted to fit the existing belief rather than changing the belief. Hitler has decided Normandy is a feint. Therefore, every piece of evidence must be understood through that lens. Large invasion force? That's what makes a feint convincing. Multiple landing beaches? That's what makes it look real. Continuous reinforcement? That's them committing to the deception. The possibility that he's wrong doesn't enter his consideration. Not because he's stupid, Hitler was many things. But stupid wasn't one of them, because he's certain. And certainty, particularly in positions of absolute power, is more dangerous than ignorance. By 2 p.m., the reports are increasingly desperate. German commanders in Normandy are pleading for help. The 716th Infantry Division, responsible for defending a large section of coast, has been effectively destroyed. The 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach, despite inflicting terrible casualties on American forces, is being pushed back by sheer weight of numbers and firepower. British forces have captured the city of Bayeux without a fight. The garrison commander simply abandoned it. Canadian troops are pushing inland toward Caen. The beachhead, initially fragile, is solidifying into something permanent. And still the panzer divisions sit motionless, waiting for orders that don't come. Hitler eats lunch at 3 p.m., his usual time, his usual meal of vegetables and salad. He discusses the morning's events with the detached interest of someone analyzing a chess game. They've committed more forces than I expected, he says between bites. That's actually good. The more they put into Normandy, the weaker they'll be at Calais. Across the table, Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, and one of the few men who can speak relatively freely, ventures a question. What if the generals are right? What if this is the only invasion? Hitler smiles. Patient, almost condescending. Then they've made a catastrophic strategic error, and we'll destroy them in Normandy. But they haven't. Eisenhower is not an idiot. Neither is Montgomery. They understand basic strategy. This is sophisticated deception, nothing more. The meal continues. Outside, the June sun is bright on alpine meadows. Inside, a man who controls the fate of millions is eating lunch while making the worst military decision of his career. And the terrifying thing is how calm he is about it. How certain, how convinced that everyone else is being fooled and only he sees clearly. Evening, June 6th, 1944. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's staff car races through the French countryside, headlights off, moving as fast as the driver dares in the gathering darkness. Rommel had been in Germany that morning, visiting his wife Lucie for her birthday, convinced the weather was too poor for an invasion. The phone call reached him at 10:15 a.m. Massive landings in Normandy. All sectors reporting enemy penetration. Your presence urgently required. He'd left immediately, driving through the day, watching Allied fighter bombers prowl the skies, knowing that his absence at this critical moment might be catastrophic. But Rommel's absence isn't what will doom the German defense. Hitler's presence, his very awake, very decisive, very wrong presence, is doing that quite effectively. Rommel arrives at his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon at 9:30 p.m. to find organized chaos. Maps covered with red markers showing Allied penetrations, telephone lines buzzing with desperate requests from frontline units, staff officers pale with exhaustion and suppressed panic. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, hands him a summary that Rommel reads twice, hoping he's misunderstood. 156,000 Allied troops estimated ashore by nightfall. Beachhead approximately 10 miles wide, in places 5 miles deep. German casualties, approximately 4,000 to 9,000, killed, wounded, or captured, exact numbers still being compiled. And most importantly, authorization to move panzer reserves, still denied by Führer headquarters. Rommel looks up from the report. Still denied? It's been 16 hours. Speidel's face is grim. The Führer believes Normandy is a diversion. He's waiting for the real invasion at Calais. For a long moment, Rommel says nothing. He spent the last 6 months preparing for this invasion, personally inspecting beach defenses, placing obstacles, positioning units, developing the strategy that bears his name. Defeat the invasion at the water's edge, hit them when they're most vulnerable, before they can establish a foothold. But that strategy required one critical element: immediate counterattack with mobile reserves, while Allied forces are still disorganized on the beaches. And Hitler has made that impossible. Get me the Berghof. Now. The call takes 15 minutes to connect secure military lines. Multiple verification protocols. When Hitler's voice finally comes through, it's relaxed, almost jovial. Rommel, I was expecting your call. You've heard about the invasion, obviously. Rommel, who has learned over years of service that Hitler responds better to careful deference than direct challenge, chooses his words with precision. Mein Führer, I've reviewed the situation. The scale of the landing suggests this may be the primary Allied effort. I request authorization to commit the panzer reserves for an immediate counterattack. Immediate? Hitler's voice carries amusement. That's exactly what Eisenhower wants us to do. Rush our forces to Normandy, commit them piecemeal, then hit us at Calais where we've weakened ourselves. Mein Führer, with respect, every hour we delay allows the enemy to strengthen their position. Their naval gunfire and air superiority make it nearly impossible to move forces in daylight. If we wait much longer, we wait, Rommel. Hitler's voice hardens. Until the situation clarifies. Until we know their full plan. Your job is to contain the beachhead with existing forces. The reserves will be committed when I determine the time is right. The call ends. Rommel stands holding the dead phone. And for one of the few times in his military career, he has no idea what to do. Because the problem isn't resources or capability. The problem is that the supreme commander of the German armed forces has made a decision based on assumptions rather than evidence. And in Hitler's Germany, there is no mechanism to override the Führer's decisions, no matter how catastrophically wrong they are. Speidel speaks quietly. What did he say? Wait. He said wait. That night, while German forces in Normandy fight desperately to contain the expanding beachhead with insufficient forces. Hitler hosts a small dinner party at the Berghof. The guests had been invited days earlier, party officials, a few industrialists, Eva Braun and her friends. Canceling would send the wrong message, suggest panic or weakness, so the dinner proceeds. The menu is vegetarian. As always, Hitler's dietary preferences dictate the entire table. The conversation is carefully controlled. Light topics only. Someone mentions the new production figures from aircraft factories. Impressive numbers, though most guests know the Luftwaffe is being bled white by Allied air superiority. Someone else discusses plans for post-war rebuilding grand boulevards, monuments, the architectural vision of a 1,000-year Reich that has perhaps a year left at most. Hitler seems relaxed, even cheerful. Only once does he reference the day's events. The Allies have made their move in Normandy, he says, cutting his vegetables with precise movements. An elaborate diversion. Within days, perhaps a week, we'll see the real invasion at Calais. Then everyone will understand why we maintained our strategic patience. Around the table, his guests nod and murmur agreement, because in Hitler's inner circle, disagreement is not merely unwelcome, it's dangerous. But in a corner of the room, an aide recently arrived from the communications center sits very still. A message in his pocket. Latest estimate, 156,000 Allied troops ashore. He doesn't mention it. No one does. The dinner continues with discussions of opera and art, and the bright future awaiting Germany after final victory. Outside, night settles over the mountains, beautiful and peaceful. 700 miles away, the night in Normandy is neither beautiful nor peaceful. Allied forces are digging in, establishing defensive positions, bringing tanks and artillery ashore, preparing for German counterattacks that tactical doctrine says should have come hours ago. American soldiers at Omaha Beach, where German resistance had been fiercest, are still finding bodies in the surf, still bringing wounded off the beach to ships converted to hospital duty. British troops near Khan are consolidating positions, expecting panzer attacks that military logic demands but that somehow aren't materializing. Canadian soldiers are pushing cautiously inland, confused by the relative lack of armored resistance. And German soldiers in defensive positions, watching Allied forces pour ashore in seemingly endless numbers, are beginning to understand something their supreme commander refuses to accept. This is not a feint. This is not a diversion. This is the invasion. And they are losing. June 7th, 1944. The second day. Hitler wakes at his usual late hour, takes his usual medications, eats his usual breakfast. The morning briefing brings news he interprets through his established framework. The beachhead has expanded. Allied forces are pushing inland. More troops and supplies coming ashore. But still no second landing at Calais. This confirms his theory, he explains to his staff. They're committed now. They're putting everything into Normandy, which means when the Calais landing comes, they'll have fewer resources for it. We're bleeding them in Normandy before the real battle even begins. General Jodl, exhausted from 40 hours with minimal sleep, tries a different approach. Mein Führer, our commanders in France, request permission to conduct limited withdrawals to more defensible positions. The beach areas are exposed to naval gunfire. No withdrawals. Hitler's voice is immediate and absolute. Every position is held. Every meter of ground is contested. The moment we start retreating, we show weakness. We fight for every inch. This doctrine, no retreat, no withdrawal, fight and die in place, has been Hitler's standard operating procedure since the desperate winter of 1941-42 on the Eastern Front, where it arguably prevented a collapse. But that was different terrain, different circumstances, different enemy capabilities. In Normandy, with overwhelming Allied air superiority and naval gunfire, the no-retreat doctrine means German units are being systematically destroyed in exposed positions they cannot abandon. By afternoon of June 7th, the numbers are even more damning. Over 250,000 Allied troops ashore. beachhead now 20 miles wide, up to 10 miles deep in some sectors, German casualties climbing toward 10,000, and still no authorization to commit the panzer reserves that sit idle, their fuel tanks full, their crews ready, waiting for orders. Rommel sends another message to the Berghof, more direct this time. Situation deteriorating rapidly. Without immediate reinforcement with armored divisions, the beachhead cannot be eliminated. Request urgent authorization to move 12th SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr divisions to attack sector. Hitler's response comes through Keitel. Containment is sufficient. Reserves will be committed when strategic situation clarifies. Continue present operations. Rommel reads this message and makes a decision that he'll later regret. He begins moving some units without explicit authorization, using technicalities about local reserves versus strategic reserves. But it's too little, too late. And the units that do move toward the beaches find themselves under constant Allied air attack. Fighter bombers, Typhoons, Thunderbolts, Lightnings prowl the roads like hawks hunting mice. Any German vehicle moving in daylight is attacked within minutes. Entire convoys are destroyed before reaching the front. The Panzer Lehr Division, finally released on June 7th, takes 3 days to move 80 miles a distance it could have covered in 6 hours without air attacks. By the time it reaches the front, it's lost 30% of its vehicles and much of its combat effectiveness. This is the cost of Hitler's delayed decision. Not just time, but capability. Every hour he waited, Allied air superiority became more dominant. Every hour he delayed, Allied positions became stronger. Every hour he refused to commit reserves, German commanders in Normandy had to fight with insufficient forces against overwhelming odds. June 8th, June 9th. The pattern continues. Hitler remains convinced that Calais is coming, remains convinced that Normandy is a feint, remains convinced that his strategic patience will be vindicated. And every day, the Allied beachhead grows larger, stronger, more impossible to eliminate. On June 10th, 4 days after the invasion, Hitler finally authorizes movement of some additional reserve units toward Normandy. Not because he's changed his mind about Calais, he still believes that's the real target, but because the situation in Normandy has deteriorated to the point where it can no longer be ignored, even as a diversion, but by then, the moment has passed. The window, when an immediate armored counterattack might have had a chance of driving Allied forces back into the sea, closed on June 6th, probably by noon. Every hour after that, the odds shifted inexorably toward the Allies. And Hitler's certainty, his absolute conviction that he understood the strategic situation better than everyone else, had kept German reserves immobile during the only hours that mattered. Military historian Max Hastings would later write, Hitler's decision to withhold the panzer reserves on June 6th did not determine whether D-Day would succeed, but it certainly determined how quickly and completely it would succeed. The invasion was going to work anyway. Allied material superiority was too great. But Hitler's decisions transformed a difficult Allied operation into a decisive victory. He gave them the time they needed, the space they required, the opportunity to establish themselves before facing serious armored counterattacks. And he did it while being completely certain he was making brilliant strategic decisions. That's what makes this story so chilling. Not that Hitler made mistakes, everyone makes mistakes in war, but that he made catastrophic mistakes with absolute confidence, that he led his forces to defeat while believing he was executing genius-level strategy, that he ignored evidence, dismissed warnings, overruled experienced commanders, and maintained his certainty even as reality collapsed around him. On June 10th, as he finally authorized movements that should have happened 4 days earlier, Hitler remained convinced that history would vindicate him, that the real invasion at Calais would come, that his patience would be proven correct. He was wrong about all of it, but he never admitted it. June 17th, 1944, 11 days after D-Day. A bunker complex near Margeval in northern France, built years earlier for Hitler's planned invasion of Britain, now repurposed for this meeting. Hitler arrives by car, refusing to fly despite the distance from Germany. Allied air superiority has made flying too dangerous. though he doesn't phrase it that way. He phrases it as preferring ground transport for security reasons. The meeting he's called includes Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, and Field Marshal Rommel, Commander of Army Group B. Both men have been requesting this conference for days. Both men have lists of urgent needs, reinforcements, authorization for withdrawals to better defensive positions, permission to conduct mobile defense rather than static defense. Both men believe they can convince Hitler to change his approach. Both men are about to discover how impossible that is. The bunker's conference room is stark, concrete walls, a large map table, harsh electric lighting. Hitler enters looking tired but alert, uniform immaculate despite the journey. He gestures to the maps. "Gentlemen, your assessment." Rommel speaks first. He's prepared his remarks carefully, organized his thoughts, marshaled evidence. "Mein Führer, the situation in Normandy is critical. The Allies now have over 500,000 troops ashore. They control a beachhead 60 miles wide and 15 miles deep. Our forces are fighting courageously, but are being overwhelmed by enemy material superiority. Allied air power is devastating. We cannot move in daylight. Naval gunfire destroys any position within range of the coast. We are losing the battle of attrition." He pauses, lets that sink in. "We need authorization for mobile defense. Allow us to withdraw from exposed positions. Establish defense lines further inland where we're not exposed to naval gunfire. Use our armor in coordinated counterattacks rather than piecemeal defensive battles." Hitler listens without expression. When Rommel finishes, Hitler speaks, and his tone is that of a teacher correcting a student's errors. "Everything you've described is exactly what the enemy wants. They want us to retreat. They want us to abandon the coast. They want us to show weakness. Every meter we give them encourages them. Every withdrawal tells them they're winning." "Mein Führer," von Rundstedt interjects, "they are winning. The mathematics are inexorable. They can replace losses. We cannot. They have unlimited supplies. We have shortages. They have total air superiority. Unless we change our approach, the approach doesn't change." Hitler's voice rises. "The doctrine is simple. Every position held, every meter contested. No retreats, no withdrawals. Make them pay for every inch." "But, mein Führer, that doctrine means we'll lose the entire army in France." Hitler's face flushes. "Lose the army? And where do we retreat to? Germany? You want to fight the battle for Germany in Germany? You want to give them France without making them bleed for it?" Von Rundstedt, 70 years old, Prussian officer of the old school, maintains his composure with visible effort. "I want to preserve forces so we can continue fighting effectively. If we lose the army in France, we lose the war. We lose the war if we show weakness." Hitler's hands are shaking now, his voice climbing toward a shout. "Every time we retreat, it proves they can beat us. Every time we abandon positions, it tells the world that the Wehrmacht can be defeated." "I held at Stalingrad for exactly this reason, to show that German forces do not break." The comparison to Stalingrad, where Hitler's no-retreat order led to the destruction of an entire army, hangs in the air like poison gas. No one mentions that Stalingrad was a catastrophic defeat precisely because of that order. No one dares. Rommel tries a different approach, his voice carefully respectful. "Mein Führer, perhaps we could discuss a political solution. Approach the British and Americans separately, negotiate some kind of armistice, then concentrate all forces against the Soviets in the East. The Western Allies fear Soviet expansion." Hitler explodes. "Political solution? Negotiate with Churchill? With Roosevelt? They demand unconditional surrender. They want to destroy Germany, partition it, eliminate it as a power. There is no political solution. There is only victory or annihilation." He's pacing now, hands gesturing wildly. "You generals, you're all the same. You don't understand willpower. You don't understand that warfare is ultimately psychological. The side that refuses to break wins. Germany has overcome worse situations, 1,918. We were defeated because of betrayal at home, not failure at the front. I will not allow that to happen again. The meeting deteriorates from there. Hitler brings up 1940. How everyone doubted his plan for France, and he was proven right. He mentions new weapons coming, V-1 flying bombs just beginning to hit London, V-2 rockets in development, jet fighters that will sweep Allied aircraft from the skies. He talks about divisions that exist only on paper, reinforcements that won't arrive, counterattacks that can't be launched, with forces that don't have fuel or ammunition. Rommel and von Rundstedt exchange glances. Both men realize the same thing simultaneously. Hitler is detached from reality. Not insane, his logic is coherent, his arguments structured, but detached from the actual situation on the ground, operating in a world where willpower overcomes material limitations, where holding untenable positions is strategic genius, where evidence that contradicts his worldview is dismissed as defeatism or cowardice. The meeting ends after 3 hours with nothing resolved. Hitler returns to Germany by car, still convinced of his strategic correctness. Rommel and von Rundstedt watch him leave. He's going to lose this war, Rommel says quietly, and blame us for not executing his perfect strategy properly. Von Rundstedt nods slowly. He's been losing it for months. Every setback is someone else's fault. Every failure is betrayal or incompetence, never his decisions. What do we do? Von Rundstedt's answer is bleak. We follow orders. We fight as best we can. And we hope the end comes quickly. July 20th, 1944. Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair. A bomb explodes in the conference room during a staff meeting. The assassination attempt, planned by German officers convinced that Hitler is leading the nation to destruction, fails. Hitler survives with minor injuries, burst eardrums, some burns, temporary paralysis in his right arm. His response reveals everything about his psychological state. He doesn't see the assassination attempt as evidence that his military leadership has alienated even his own officers. He sees it as proof of betrayal, of conspiracy, of weakness among the general staff. The purge that follows kills or imprisons thousands, many who had nothing to do with the plot, but whose loyalty Hitler now questions. Among those eventually forced to commit suicide, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who knew about the plot but didn't participate. Hitler's paranoia, already intense, becomes absolute. He trusts no one, questions every report, assumes every setback is sabotage. And in France, the military situation continues its inevitable deterioration. July 25th, Operation Cobra. The American breakout from Normandy. German lines collapse. August 15th, Operation Dragoon. Allied landings in southern France. August 25th, Paris liberated. September, Allied forces reach the German border. And through it all, Hitler's explanations remain consistent. Betrayal, incompetence, lack of will, cowardice. Never. I made wrong decisions. Never. My strategic assessment was flawed. Never. I should have listened to my generals. In his final months, trapped in the Führerbunker beneath Berlin as Soviet artillery pounds the city to rubble, Hitler will still be moving non-existent armies on maps, still planning counterattacks with divisions that have been destroyed, still convinced that willpower can overcome material reality. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops close in, he'll commit suicide. His final political testament blames everyone but himself. The generals betrayed him. The people weren't worthy of his leadership. International Jewry conspired against Germany. Nowhere in that testament does he write, "I made catastrophic decisions that destroyed the nation I claimed to love." Nowhere does he acknowledge, "My certainty was my greatest weakness." Nowhere does he accept, "I refused to wake up to reality until reality destroyed me." Berlin, May 1945. The war in Europe is over. The Third Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years lasted 12. In the ruins of German cities, Survivors emerge from basements and bomb shelters to find a nation that no longer exists. 80 million Germans, 7 million dead, 10 million displaced, cities reduced to rubble, industry destroyed. The nation partitioned by victorious allies who will divide it into occupation zones for decades. And among the causes of this catastrophe, buried beneath the larger crimes and atrocities, lies a smaller truth that military historians will debate for generations. Hitler's decisions on June 6, 1944, didn't determine whether Germany would lose the war. Germany was going to lose regardless. Allied material superiority was overwhelming, but those decisions determined how Germany would lose. How quickly, how completely, how catastrophically. At the Nuremberg trials, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who served as chief of the High Command throughout the war, will testify about Hitler's decision-making process. The prosecutors ask, why weren't the Panzer Reserves committed immediately on D-Day? Keitel's answer is carefully phrased, but devastating. The Führer believed Normandy was a diversion. He was convinced the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. He maintained this belief for several weeks, despite evidence to the contrary. By the time he authorized full commitment of reserves, the opportunity had passed. Why didn't you or other commanders convince him otherwise? Keitel's pause is long. The Führer did not accept contradiction on strategic matters. He believed his intuition was superior to conventional military analysis, and in the past, he had been proven correct often enough that this belief became unshakable. Historians will unpack this testimony for decades, because it reveals something more fundamental than just military errors. It reveals the danger of certainty itself. Hitler was not stupid. He was not irrational. His arguments were internally consistent. He was not lacking in military knowledge. He'd absorbed enormous amounts of strategic and tactical information. But he was certain, absolutely, completely, unshakably certain. And in positions of absolute power, certainty becomes catastrophic, because certainty closes off the possibility of error. Certainty reinterprets contradictory evidence rather than changing beliefs. Certainty sees disagreement as disloyalty rather than honest counsel. Psychologist Philip Tetlock, in his research on political judgment, would later identify this pattern. Leaders who make the worst predictions are those who are most certain of their assessments, not because they are unintelligent, but because their certainty prevents them from updating beliefs when reality changes. Hitler, on June 6, 1944, was operating at peak certainty. He'd defied conventional wisdom before and won. He'd ignored his general's caution and been proven right. He trusted his strategic intuition over evidence and succeeded, until he didn't. Until the one time when he was catastrophically wrong, at the moment when being wrong mattered most. June 6, 2024, 80th anniversary of D-Day, Normandy, France. Veterans now in their late 92nds, the last living participants in that day gather at ceremony sites. American, British, Canadian, French, they shake hands, share memories, honor fallen comrades. A 99-year-old American veteran is interviewed by a journalist. What do you remember most about D-Day? The old man thinks for a long moment. I remember being terrified on the boat going in. Remember the naval guns firing over our heads. Remember thinking we might all die on that beach. What saved you? Another pause. The Germans didn't counterattack, not right away. We got ashore, got organized, got off the beach. If they'd hit us with tanks that first day, when we were all mixed up and confused, different story maybe. Why didn't they counterattack? The veteran shrugs. Don't know. Always wondered about that. Someone on their side made a hell of a mistake. That mistake has a name. Adolf Hitler. And the lesson, if there is one, extends beyond World War II. Into every boardroom where a CEO is so certain of a strategy that contradictory market data is dismissed. Into every government where leaders are so convinced of their wisdom that expert advice is ignored. Into every relationship where someone is so sure they're right that their partner's perspective becomes irrelevant. Certainty is seductive. It's comfortable. It makes decision-making easy. But certainty in complex situations, where multiple factors interact in unpredictable ways, where information is incomplete, where opponents have agency, is almost always a mistake. The wisest decisions come from what psychologist Carl Weick calls confident uncertainty. Strong enough convictions to act, but humble enough to change course when evidence demands it. Hitler had the confidence without the uncertainty, the conviction without the humility, the certainty without the wisdom to question it. And on June 6th, 1944, when 156,000 Allied troops were pouring ashore on Normandy beaches, when German commanders were desperately requesting authorization to commit panzer reserves, when the fate of the European war hung in the balance, Adolf Hitler was certain that Normandy was a feint, certain that Calais was the real target, certain that patience would be vindicated, certain that his strategic genius exceeded everyone else's understanding. He was wrong about all of it, but he never knew it, never accepted it. Went to his death in that Berlin bunker still believing that Germany had been betrayed by weak generals and unworthy people, never understanding that his own certainty had been the greatest betrayal of all. The sun sets over the Normandy beaches. Tourists walk the sand where soldiers died 8 decades ago. Children play near monuments they don't yet understand. And somewhere in that fading light is a lesson that every generation must relearn. Certainty in the hands of power is not strength, it's blindness. And blindness, when nations hang in the balance, is the most dangerous weapon of all.